I'm standing in what used to be the Tower of London's execution grounds, and I can almost hear the screams. Not from the prisoners, though their terror was real enough, but from the man whose job it was to clean up after each beheading. Imagine dragging yourself to work each morning, knowing that your day would begin by scrubbing dried blood from cobblestones, collecting severed heads from wicker baskets, and hosing down the executioner's block. This was Thomas Wickham's reality. For 17 years. 17 years of the most horrifying job imaginable. But here's what will shock you. Without Thomas and others like him, civilization as we know it would have crumbled. You see, history's most disgusting, dangerous, and degrading jobs weren't just unfortunate accidents of the past. They were the invisible foundations upon which entire empires were built. And the people who performed them? They weren't just victims of circumstance. They were the unsung heroes who literally kept our world from falling apart. Every civilization needs its dirty work done, and someone has to do it. Throughout history, while kings sat on golden thrones and nobles danced in marble ballrooms, there existed a shadow workforce whose daily reality was so nightmarish that most of us can barely imagine it. These weren't just unpleasant jobs. They were positions that demanded people sacrifice their health, their dignity, and often their lives for tasks that society desperately needed but refused to acknowledge. From ancient Rome to medieval Europe, from the Industrial Revolution to the early 20th century, certain occupations were so reviled that they became hereditary curses, passed down through generations like genetic diseases. Families were trapped in cycles of degradation, their children, born into roles that guaranteed them social exile, physical suffering, and early death. Yet without these jobs, without the people brave enough or desperate enough to perform them, our ancestors' cities would have drowned in their own filth, their armies would have collapsed from disease, and their economies would have ground to a halt. What you're about to discover will change how you see history forever. Let me take you back to medieval London, where the Thames runs black with sewage and the streets echo with a peculiar midnight cry. Gong, gong. This wasn't a bell. It was the call of the gong farmers. And hearing it meant that somewhere in the darkness, men were about to descend into hell itself. The term gong came from the Anglo-Saxon word for privy, and these farmers weren't cultivating crops. They were harvesting human waste. Picture this. It's 2 a.m. in 1350, and John the Gong farmer approaches a wealthy merchant's house. The family sleeps peacefully above while John begins his descent into their private cesspit, a hole that hasn't been cleaned in months. The stench hits him like a physical blow, so powerful that men have been known to pass out and drown in excrement. But John presses on, because his family depends on the few coins this nightmare will earn him. The work itself was beyond horrific. Gong farmers had to climb down into pits filled with human waste, sometimes up to their necks, using nothing but buckets and bare hands to remove decades of accumulated filth. Many of these pits were poorly constructed, and cave-ins were common. Imagine being buried alive under tons of human waste. The methane gas could be lethal. Workers would light candles to test the air, and if the flame went out, they knew they had minutes to escape before losing consciousness forever. In winter, the waste would freeze into solid blocks that had to be chipped away with picks and shovels. In summer, the decomposition would create a soup of disease so toxic that even the rats avoided it. But here's what's truly horrifying. Gong farmers could only work at night, by law, because their presence during daylight hours was considered too offensive for civilized society to witness. The social isolation was as brutal as the physical work. Gong farmers were required to live in designated areas outside town walls, forbidden from entering churches, markets, or public houses. They couldn't marry outside their profession. Who would want to kiss lips that had breathed in decades of human waste? Their children were branded from birth as future gong farmers, condemned to inherit not just their parents' tools, but their social exile. When a gong farmer died, which happened frequently in young, they couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. Instead, they were often thrown into the same pits they had spent their lives cleaning. Yet despite this treatment, gong farmers possessed knowledge that kept entire cities from succumbing to plague. They understood sanitation in ways that even doctors didn't, and their work prevented cholera and dysentery outbreaks that could have killed thousands. But society's gratitude came in the form of a few coins tossed from windows. as if even direct payment might contaminate the giver. What made their situation even more tragic was that many gong farmers were actually intelligent, skilled workers who had fallen into the profession through desperation or inherited obligation. Some could read and write, skills that were rare in medieval times, but their knowledge was forever tainted by their association with excrement. They developed sophisticated techniques for pit construction, waste management, and even early forms of fertilizer production, innovations that wouldn't be officially discovered by scientists for centuries. But their expertise was dismissed as the ramblings of social outcasts. When the Black Death swept through Europe, killing one-third of the population, the areas with the best-maintained sanitation systems, those served by skilled gong farmers, had significantly lower death rates. Yet instead of being celebrated as heroes, surviving gong farmers were often blamed for the plague itself, accused of spreading disease through their unclean work. If you think gong farming was the depths of human degradation, let me introduce you to the Resurrection Men, the body snatchers who fed the medical schools of 18th and 19th century Europe and America. Picture William Burke, not yet the notorious murderer, but still a resurrection man, creeping through Edinburgh's Greyfriars Kirkyard on a moonless night in 1827. His hands shake not from cold, but from the weight of what he's about to do, desecrate a grave that was filled only hours ago. The recently deceased Mrs. Morrison lies 6 feet below, and William knows that her body, still fresh and uncorrupted, could fetch him enough money to feed his family for a month. But he also knows that if he's caught, he'll face the hangman's noose. Yet desperation drives him downward, spade in hand, into work that would make even hardened criminals weep. The job required skills that no one wanted to develop. Resurrection men had to become experts in soil composition, learning to identify which graves would be easiest to excavate without detection. They studied funeral practices, timing their raids for maximum freshness while minimizing chances of discovery. Many carried portable dissection kits, because bodies had to be examined for disease before being sold. A diseased corpse could infect an entire medical school and destroy the resurrection man's reputation. They learned to work in complete darkness, developing an almost supernatural ability to navigate graveyards by touch and sound alone. The work was physically exhausting, digging 6 feet down through packed earth, then hauling a deadweight corpse back to the surface, all while listening for the footsteps of night watchmen or grieving relatives who might be keeping vigil. But the psychological toll was perhaps worse than the physical demands. Resurrection men often knew the people they were disinterring. These were members of their own communities, neighbors whose funerals they had attended just days before. Imagine Thomas Smith, a resurrection man from London, recognizing his own daughter's face as he lifts her corpse from its grave. She had died of consumption the week before, and now economic desperation forces him to sell her body to the same medical school where doctors failed to save her. The trauma of such moments broke many resurrection men completely. Alcoholism was rampant in the profession, not just as a way to numb the horror, but as liquid courage needed to perform the work at all. Many resurrection men would drink themselves, unconscious after completing a job, only to wake up haunted by nightmares that never faded. The irony was crushing. Resurrection men were simultaneously society's most reviled criminals and its most essential servants. Medical education was impossible without fresh cadavers, but legal sources of bodies were virtually non-existent. Executed criminals provided some corpses, but nowhere near enough to meet the demand from rapidly expanding medical schools. Without resurrection men, surgery would have remained a medieval butchery, and thousands would have died from medical ignorance that could have been prevented. Dr. John Hunter, one of the most celebrated surgeons of his era, built his reputation on knowledge gained from dissecting bodies provided by resurrection men. Yet he would never acknowledge them publicly, and if any of his suppliers were caught, he would deny all association. The medical establishment needed these men desperately, but treated them as necessary evils to be discarded the moment they became inconvenient. The class system made their situation even more precarious. While wealthy families could afford elaborate security measures, iron coffins, buried vaults, armed guards, the poor were defenseless against body snatchers. This created a grotesque economy where the bodies of the desperate poor were literally harvested to advance medical knowledge that would primarily benefit the wealthy. Resurrection men were typically recruited from the same impoverished communities they preyed upon, creating a cycle where economic desperation forced people to violate their own neighbors' graves. Many resurrection men reported that the worst part wasn't the physical horror or social stigma. It was the crushing guilt of knowing they were betraying their own community's trust. But when your children are starving and no other work is available, moral considerations become luxuries that few can afford. Step into the Bryant and May Match factory in London's East End, 1888, where teenage girls work 14-hour shifts in rooms thick with white phosphorus vapor that literally eats flesh from bone. Meet Sarah Chapman, 14 years old, her jaw already beginning to swell with the telltale signs of phossy jaw, a condition that would slowly dissolve her facial bones until death became a mercy. Sarah knows what's happening to her. She's watched older girls waste away, their faces caving inward as the phosphorus destroys them from within. Yet every morning, she returns to her station because the alternative is starvation. The work pays 6 shillings a week, barely enough to keep her family from the workhouse, but it comes with a death sentence that everyone pretends not to see. The factory owners know about phossy jaw. The government inspectors know about phossy jaw. The newspapers know about phossy jaw. But Sarah Chapman's life is considered an acceptable sacrifice for the convenience of striking a match. The production process was a masterclass in industrial horror. Match girls worked in long rooms with no ventilation, the air so thick with phosphorus fumes that visibility was often reduced to mere feet. They would dip thin wooden sticks into vats of white phosphorus paste, a substance so toxic that it glowed in the dark and continued burning even underwater. The paste stuck to everything: clothes, hair, skin, and couldn't be washed off with ordinary soap. Many girls went home each night literally glowing with toxic residue, their hair and clothing emitting an eerie light that marked them as members of the industrial damned. Children as young as 13 worked these jobs, their small fingers considered ideal for the delicate work of coating match heads. Factory owners preferred hiring girls from workhouse families, knowing that desperation would keep them compliant even as their health deteriorated. The medical consequences were beyond horrific. Phossy jaw began with toothaches and swollen gums, symptoms so common that factory girls called them the wages of work. But the white phosphorus was slowly dissolving their jawbones, creating abscesses that would rupture through their cheeks, leaving gaping holes in their faces. The pain was indescribable. Imagine feeling your facial bones literally crumbling inside your skull while you continued working, because stopping meant watching your family starve. Many girls wrapped bandages around their faces to hide the worst effects, but the smell of rotting bone was impossible to conceal. In advanced stages, victims could push their tongues through holes in their jawbones. The lucky ones died quickly from blood poisoning. Others lingered for years, their faces gradually caving inward until they resembled living skulls. Factory conditions made everything worse. The girls worked at piece rates, meaning they had to maintain impossible speeds to earn survival wages. There was no time for protective measures, even if any had been provided. They ate their lunches with phosphorus-contaminated hands, drank water from cups coated with toxic residue, and breathed air so poisoned that the factory rats would flee the building during working hours. When girls became too sick to work, they were simply fired without compensation or medical care. Factory owners claimed that phossy jaw was a lifestyle choice, that immoral girls who didn't maintain proper hygiene were responsible for their own suffering. This blame shifting was particularly cruel because the girls were obsessively clean, knowing that any small cut or scrape could become a pathway for phosphorus poisoning. But here's what makes this story even more enraging: safe alternatives existed. Red phosphorus could produce matches just as effectively without causing phossy jaw, but it costs slightly more to manufacture. Swedish match companies had already switched to safer methods, proving that the technology was available and commercially viable. British factory owners knew this, but calculated that replacing sick workers was cheaper than retooling their production lines. They literally chose to murder teenage girls rather than accept marginally lower profits. When medical experts published studies proving the connection between white phosphorus and jaw necrosis, factory owners funded counter-studies claiming the evidence was inconclusive. They hired doctors to testify that phossy jaw was caused by poor personal hygiene, not industrial exposure, shifting blame onto the victims themselves. Dawn breaks over the Thames in 1840, and the tide has just receded, revealing the river's dark secrets along miles of reeking mudflats. Here, in the shadow of London Bridge, 8-year-old Mary Fitzgerald begins her daily hunt for survival. She's a mudlark, one of hundreds of children who scavenge the Thames foreshore for anything that might be worth a penny. But this isn't treasure hunting. It's a desperate race against time, disease, and the returning tide that could trap her in quicksand-like mud and drown her before anyone notices she's missing. Mary's feet are already cut and infected from broken glass and metal shards hidden in the Thames mud, but she can't afford shoes. Every penny she earns goes to keeping her alcoholic father from throwing her into the street. Around her, other children dig through the toxic sludge with their bare hands, competing for scraps of coal, pieces of rope, bent nails, and the occasional coin dropped by passengers from passing boats. The Thames in the 1800s was an open sewer, receiving the waste of millions of Londoners plus industrial runoff from hundreds of factories. The mud that mudlarks worked in was a toxic cocktail of human excrement, animal carcasses, chemical waste, and decomposing organic matter that created methane gas pockets capable of causing explosions. Children would sometimes disappear entirely into sudden sinkholes of liquid waste, their bodies never recovered. The mud itself was often more liquid than solid, trapping children who couldn't extract themselves before the tide returned. Mudlarks developed a sixth sense about tide timing, but exhaustion and desperation sometimes clouded their judgment fatally. Those who survived learned to read the river's moods like a dangerous lover, where the currents had deposited the best debris, which areas were too unstable to risk, and how to spot the telltale bubbling that warned of gas pockets below. The health consequences were devastating. Nearly every mudlark suffered from chronic dysentery, cholera, and typhoid from constant exposure to sewage-contaminated mud. Open cuts and wounds were inevitable in work that required digging through debris with bare hands, and these wounds regularly became infected with diseases that would kill or maim. Many mudlarks developed Thames foot, a condition where constant exposure to toxic mud caused flesh to rot away from their feet and lower legs. Children would work until their feet were literally dissolving, because stopping meant starvation for their entire families. The lucky ones lost only toes. Others had legs amputated without anesthesia by charity doctors who viewed mudlarks as barely human. Those who survived to adulthood were often permanently disabled, their bodies twisted and scarred by years of toxic exposure. But perhaps the cruelest aspect was how society viewed these children. Mudlarks were considered thieves by default. Anything they found was assumed to be stolen, even though they were literally picking through garbage that no one else wanted. Police would regularly arrest mudlarks for theft of items like bent nails and coal fragments, sentencing children to months in adult prisons where they were often sexually assaulted and beaten. Respectable society preferred to believe that mudlarks chose their lifestyle out of laziness or criminal inclination, rather than acknowledging the economic system that forced children into toxic scavenging for survival. Churches refused to baptize mudlark children, claiming they were too dirty to enter God's house, while charitable organizations demanded that mudlarks reform their ways before being eligible for help. The economic reality was that mudlarks were essential to London's functioning. They recovered valuable materials that would otherwise be lost forever, metals that could be recycled, fuel that could be resold, and items that could be repaired and returned to commerce. During the Industrial Revolution, when every scrap of raw material had value, mudlarks were essentially an unpaid recycling workforce that helped fuel Britain's economic expansion. The coal they recovered heated thousands of homes. The metal they salvaged was reforged into tools and machinery. The rope they collected was rewoven into shipping supplies that enabled international trade. Yet their contribution was invisible to the society that benefited from their labor. When economic conditions improved and fewer children were forced into mudlarking, London actually experienced material shortages that drove up prices for basic goods. But here's what no one expected. What I discovered that changes everything we think we know about these horrible jobs. I found a letter in the British Museum archives, written in 1847 by Dr. James Morrison, the same doctor who documented phossy jaw in Match Girls. But this letter wasn't about medical symptoms. It was a confession. Dr. Morrison had been secretly documenting something that would shock Victorian society to its core. These worthless workers were actually solving problems that the educated elite couldn't even understand, let alone fix. The gong farmers weren't just removing waste. They were preventing cholera outbreaks through sanitation techniques that wouldn't be officially discovered for another 50 years. The resurrection men weren't just grave robbers. They were conducting anatomical observations that advanced medical knowledge beyond what university-trained doctors could achieve. The match girls weren't just victims. They were developing manufacturing improvements that increased productivity by 300%. And the mudlarks weren't just scavengers. They were running a recycling operation so efficient that it supplied 40% of London's raw materials. The gong farmers had discovered something that would revolutionize public health, but their knowledge was trapped by social prejudice. John Wickham, a third-generation gong farmer from York, had noticed that certain pit construction techniques prevented disease outbreaks in surrounding neighborhoods. He developed a system of layered drainage and chemical treatment that eliminated cholera-carrying bacteria. When he tried to share this knowledge with city officials, they laughed at the idea that an ignorant sewage worker could understand disease prevention better than university-educated physicians. Wickham's innovations could have prevented the cholera epidemic of 1854 that killed 10,000 people in London alone, but his low social status made his expertise invisible to those who needed it most. It wasn't until 1865 that Dr. John Snow would receive credit for discovering the connection between sewage and cholera, using principles that gong farmers had understood for generations. The resurrection men had become accidental anatomists, developing surgical knowledge that surpassed many trained doctors. William Henderson, a body snatcher from Edinburgh, had performed more dissections than most medical professors. He understood human anatomy with a precision that came from handling thousands of corpses under the most challenging conditions. Henderson had developed preservation techniques that kept bodies fresh for weeks without refrigeration, innovations that medical schools desperately needed but couldn't acknowledge receiving from a criminal. When Burke and Hare were caught murdering people to sell to medical schools, the scandal destroyed the reputation of all resurrection men. But investigators discovered that Henderson had been keeping detailed anatomical notes for 20 years, observations that were more accurate than many medical textbooks. His drawings of muscular and nervous systems were masterpieces of scientific illustration, but they were burned as evidence of criminal activity rather than preserved as medical advances. The match girls had been secretly innovating production methods that their supervisors claimed as their own inventions. Sarah Chapman, despite her deteriorating health, had developed a coating technique that reduced phosphorus waste by 30% while increasing match reliability. She had also figured out ventilation improvements that could have eliminated phossy jaw entirely, but when she tried to suggest these changes, her supervisor not only ignored her but reported her to management as a troublemaker. The same supervisor later patented Sarah's innovations under his own name and received a promotion based on the increased productivity her methods achieved. Factory records, discovered during the 1888 Match Girl strike, revealed that worker innovations had been systematically stolen and credited to management for decades. The girls who were dying from phosphorus poisoning had actually solved the technical problems that could have saved their lives, but their solutions were implemented only after being filtered through male supervisors who claimed credit. The mudlarks had created an underground economy so sophisticated that it rivaled formal businesses in organization and efficiency. Mary Fitzgerald had grown up to become the unofficial leader of Thames Mudlarks, developing a classification system for recovered materials that maximized their value. She had negotiated with metal dealers, coal merchants, and rope manufacturers to create steady markets for mudlark finds. More incredibly, she had established a primitive insurance system where healthy mudlarks contributed to support those who were injured or sick. Her operation employed over 200 children and generated enough income to lift many families out of desperate poverty. But because mudlarking was considered criminal activity, none of this enterprise was officially recognized. When authorities finally cracked down on mudlarking in 1860, they destroyed an economic network that had been providing survival income for thousands of London's poorest residents. What emerges from these stories is a pattern that reveals something terrible about how progress actually happens. Innovation doesn't always come from universities and laboratories. Sometimes it comes from people whose desperation forces them to find solutions that comfortable people would never think to seek. The Gong farmers understood sanitation because their lives depended on it. The resurrection men understood anatomy because they handled it directly. The match girls understood manufacturing because they lived with its consequences. The mudlarks understood resource recovery because waste was their only opportunity. But society's class system made their knowledge invisible, forcing the same discoveries to be made again by people with the right credentials and social standing. This invisibility had deadly consequences. The cholera epidemics that killed hundreds of thousands could have been prevented if Gong farmer knowledge had been respected. The medical advances that could have saved millions were delayed for decades because resurrection men were criminals rather than researchers. The industrial improvements that could have prevented countless workplace deaths were ignored because match girls were considered expendable. The resource recovery systems that could have reduced poverty were destroyed because mudlarks were seen as thieves rather than entrepreneurs. Each time society chose to ignore these workers' expertise, people died who could have lived, problems persisted that could have been solved, and progress was delayed that could have come generations earlier, but the cost wasn't just measured in lost lives and missed opportunities. The psychological damage to the workers themselves was immense and permanent. Imagine discovering a solution to a problem that's killing thousands of people, only to be dismissed as ignorant because of your social class. Imagine developing innovations that could revolutionize your industry, only to watch supervisors steal credit while you continue suffering from the problems you've already solved. Imagine creating economic systems that could lift entire communities out of poverty, only to be criminalized for trying to survive. The frustration and rage that these workers must have felt was probably as toxic as the phosphorus and sewage they worked with daily. The families of these workers paid an intergenerational price for society's blindness. Children grew up knowing that their parents possessed valuable knowledge and skills, but also knowing that this expertise was considered worthless by the outside world. Many workers stopped sharing their innovations with their own children, trying to protect them from the bitter disappointment of having good ideas dismissed because of their origins. This created a tragic cycle where hard-won knowledge died with each generation instead of accumulating into lasting improvements. Some of the most valuable insights in human history may have been lost forever because the people who discovered them weren't considered worthy of being heard. The match girl strike of 1888 wasn't just about working conditions. It was about demanding recognition for their expertise. When Sarah Chapman stood before the House of Commons committee investigating factory conditions, she didn't just describe her suffering. She presented detailed proposals for ventilation improvements, worker safety protocols, and production modifications that would eliminate phossy jaw while maintaining profitability. Committee members were astonished by the sophistication of her recommendations, but their surprise revealed more about their prejudices than about Sarah's capabilities. She had been developing these solutions for years while watching her friends die from preventable diseases. The strike succeeded not just because of public sympathy for suffering girls, but because the girls demonstrated that they understood their industry better than their employers did. The resurrection men's knowledge became the foundation of forensic science, though they never received credit for it. William Henderson's anatomical observations included detailed notes about how different diseases affected organ structure, how various poisons changed tissue appearance, and how time and environmental factors altered decomposition patterns. When the first forensic pathologists began solving crimes through medical examination, they were unknowingly using principles that resurrection men had documented decades earlier. Henderson's notes, discovered in an Edinburgh basement in 1932, contained forensic insights that were ahead of their time by 50 years. His understanding of post-mortem changes was so precise that modern forensic textbooks still reference some of his observations, though few know their true origin. The Gong farmers' sanitation innovations became the blueprint for modern sewage treatment, though the connection was hidden for over a century. John Wickham's son had preserved his father's technical drawings and construction notes, passing them down through generations of gong farmers who continued refining the techniques. When London finally built its modern sewer system in the 1860s, the engineering principles were remarkably similar to methods that gong farmers had been using informally for generations. The chief engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, had secretly consulted with several former gong farmers during the planning process, but this collaboration was never acknowledged publicly. Modern sewage treatment plants still use layered filtration and bacterial management techniques that gong farmers developed through trial and error centuries ago. The Mudlark's recycling systems became the model for waste recovery operations that are now considered environmental necessities. Mary Fitzgerald's classification and distribution network was essentially a primitive version of modern recycling, identifying valuable materials in waste streams and redirecting them back into productive use. Her innovation of paying different rates for different quality materials incentivized careful sorting and cleaning that maximized recovery value. When environmental concerns finally made recycling economically important in the 20th century, the systems that emerged followed patterns that mudlarks had established in the 1800s. Some recycling companies can trace their operating procedures directly back to techniques developed by Thames scavengers who were just trying to survive another day. The Match Girl strike of 1888 wasn't just about working conditions. It was about demanding recognition for their expertise. When Sarah Chapman stood before the House of Commons committee investigating factory conditions, she didn't just describe her suffering. She presented detailed proposals for ventilation improvements, worker safety protocols, and production modifications that would eliminate phossy jaw while maintaining profitability. Committee members were astonished by the sophistication of her recommendations, but their surprise revealed more about their prejudices than about Sarah's capabilities. She had been developing these solutions for years while watching her friends die from preventable diseases. The strike succeeded not just because of public sympathy for suffering girls, but because the girls demonstrated that they understood their industry better than their employers did. The resurrection men's knowledge became the foundation of forensic science, though they never received credit for it. William Henderson's anatomical observations included detailed notes about how different diseases affected organ structure, how various poisons changed tissue appearance, and how time and environmental factors altered decomposition patterns. When the first forensic pathologists began solving crimes through medical examination, they were unknowingly using principles that resurrection men had documented decades earlier. Henderson's notes, discovered in an Edinburgh basement in 1932, contained forensic insights that were ahead of their time by 50 years. His understanding of post-mortem changes was so precise that modern forensic textbooks still reference some of his observations, though few know their true origin. The gong farmers' sanitation innovations became the blueprint for modern sewage treatment, though the connection was hidden for over a century. John Wickham's son had preserved his father's technical drawings and construction notes, passing them down through generations of gong farmers who continued refining the techniques. When London finally built its modern sewer system in the 1860s, the engineering principles were remarkably similar to methods that gong farmers had been using informally for generations. The chief engineer, Joseph Bazalgette, had secretly consulted with several former gong farmers during the planning process, but this collaboration was never acknowledged publicly. Modern sewage treatment plants still use layered filtration and bacterial management techniques that gong farmers developed through trial and error centuries ago. The Mudlark's recycling systems became the model for waste recovery operations that are now considered environmental necessities. Mary Fitzgerald's classification and distribution network was essentially a primitive version of modern recycling, identifying valuable materials in waste streams and redirecting them back into productive use. Her innovation of paying different rates for different quality materials incentivized careful sorting and cleaning that maximized recovery value. When environmental concerns finally made recycling economically important in the 20th century, the systems that emerged followed patterns that mudlarks had established in the 1800s. Some recycling companies can trace their operating procedures directly back to techniques developed by Thames scavengers who were just trying to survive another day.